The morning air smelled like jet fuel and ambition at Westfield Air Force Base. For the past 3 years, Diane Reynolds had breathed it in like oxygen, letting it fill her lungs and her dreams. Today, though, something felt different as she zipped up her flight suit and checked her reflection in the small mirror of her locker. Her eyes looked tired but determined. "Late night studying those flight manuals again, Reynolds?" Lieutenant Cooper asked as he passed by, his voice carrying that familiar mix of respect and uncertainty. He never quite knew what to make of her. "Someone's got to read them," Diane replied with a small smile, closing her locker door with a gentle click. The truth was, Diane had spent the night running mental simulations of today's training exercise. While everyone else would follow the standard approach they'd been taught, she had spotted something in the weather patterns and fuel consumption rates that nobody else seemed to notice. It wasn't about being clever, it was about being thorough. Diane had never fit the typical fighter-pilot mold. Where others were loud and boastful in the mess hall, she was thoughtful and observant. When fellow trainees competed to see who could pull the most Gs or execute the flashiest maneuvers, Diane focused on precision and efficiency. Her instructors often said she flew like someone who had been born in the sky, natural, intuitive, but in a way they couldn't quite teach or replicate. This made some people uncomfortable, especially Colonel Harwood. "Reynolds," the colonel's voice boomed across the briefing room as pilots settled into their seats. "I expect you'll be following protocol to the letter today. No more of your improvisations." A few chuckles rippled through the room. Diane nodded respectfully, feeling 20 pairs of eyes on her. Last month, she'd modified a training exercise approach that saved 30% in fuel consumption, but deviated from established procedures. The success had made the colonel look rigid and outdated, something he hadn't forgotten. "Yes, sir," she said simply. The morning briefing outlined their objective: simulate an escort mission through mountainous terrain with limited fuel reserves. It was designed to test decision-making under pressure, the kind of scenario where split-second choices determined who came home and who didn't. As the pilots dispersed to their aircraft, Diane felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Captain Reeves, one of the few instructors who seemed to understand her approach. "Don't let Harwood get in your head," he said quietly. "But maybe today isn't the day to reinvent the wheel." Diane nodded, appreciating the concern in his eyes. "I'll fly by the book, sir." But as she climbed into the cockpit of her training jet and began the pre-flight checklist, Diane's mind kept returning to the weather data. A strong high-pressure system was creating unusual wind patterns in the training zone. Following standard procedure would push them straight into a powerful headwind on the return leg, burning precious fuel they couldn't afford to lose in this exercise. The tower cleared her for takeoff, and Diane felt the familiar push of acceleration as her aircraft raced down the runway and lifted into the clear blue sky. Freedom. This was the only place she had ever truly felt it. Up here, it didn't matter that she hadn't come from a military family, or that she'd grown up in a trailer park with a single mom who worked double shifts. The sky didn't care about any of that. Diane joined the formation, taking her position as they headed toward the training zone. Through her headset, she could hear the chatter of her fellow pilots, confident, sometimes cocky, completely at home in this world that had always viewed her as a visitor rather than a resident. The first phase of the mission went smoothly. They navigated the simulated threat environment, responding to the electronic enemies that appeared on their screens. Diane performed flawlessly, hitting every mark with textbook precision. Maybe Captain Reeves was right. Maybe today was the day to just follow the rules. Then came the call from Mission Control. Weather advisory updated. Winds at return corridor now sustained at 45 knots, gusting to 60. That was significantly stronger than forecast. Diane did the mental calculations instantly. If they took the planned return route, at least 2 jets would run dangerously low on fuel before reaching base. But there was another way, a narrow valley to the east that would add 5 minutes to their flight time but would keep them sheltered from the worst. Headwinds protocol said to stick to the planned route and adjust throttle settings to compensate. But those protocols were written for average conditions, not these winds. Diane's hands hovered over her controls as indecision gripped her for the first time in her flying career. All units maintain course as briefed. Adjust fuel consumption per Section 7 of the flight plan. Colonel Harwood's voice cut through the radio chatter. He was monitoring from the command center, clearly anticipating someone might suggest deviating. Diane watched her fuel gauge, knowing what would happen. 10 minutes into their return leg, warning lights began flashing in multiple cockpits. Tower, this is Falcon 3. Fuel reserves approaching minimum, came the first call. Tension evident in the pilot's voice. Falcon 5, same situation, reported another moments later. Diane keyed her mic. All units, this is Falcon 7. Recommend immediate course correction to heading 115. There's a valley route that will shelter us from the headwind. A moment of silence followed. She had just contradicted a direct order from Colonel Harwood. Negative, Falcon 7, came the Colonel's immediate response. Maintain current heading. All pilots adjust to maximum fuel efficiency settings. Diane watched the mountains ahead, knowing the valley entrance was coming up fast. It was their last chance to change course. Her thumb hovered over the transmit button as she made her decision. This is Falcon 7. I'm observing dangerous fuel consumption rates across multiple aircraft. I am adjusting course to 115 to ensure safe return of all units. Anyone who wishes to follow, you'll need to turn in 30 seconds. She banked her jet sharply, breaking formation. For a terrible moment, she flew alone, the Colonel's angry demands crackling through her headset. Then another jet appeared on her wing. Then another. Within moments, the entire formation had followed her lead. 20 minutes later, they all landed safely with fuel to spare. The debriefing room, however, felt colder than the high-altitude air they'd just left behind. Colonel Harwood didn't shout. That might have been easier to take. Instead, he spoke with icy precision as Diane stood at attention before him and the review board. Lieutenant Reynolds has once again demonstrated an inability to follow direct orders and adhere to established protocols, he said, looking at the other officers rather than at her. While her alternative route did result in sufficient fuel reserves, that is beside the point. Military aviation functions on the principle of disciplined execution of orders. Without that discipline, we have chaos. Captain Reeves cleared his throat. With respect, Colonel, the changing weather conditions created a scenario where standard protocols became dangerous. Lieutenant Reynolds recognized this and took appropriate action that ensured the safety of all personnel and aircraft. What she recognized was an opportunity to showcase her supposed superiority by countermanding my direct order. Harwood replied sharply, "This isn't the first time. It won't be the last unless we take action now." Diane remained silent, eyes fixed on a point on the wall behind the review panel. She knew what was coming. "The board has reached a decision," announced General Wallace, the base commander who had been quietly observing until now. "Lieutenant Reynolds, while your flying skills are not in question, your ability to function within the necessary command structure of this unit is. Effective immediately, you are being reassigned to ground logistics and support." The words hit Diane like a physical blow. Ground logistics, a desk job. The end of her flying career before it had really begun. "Sir, request permission to speak," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Denied." Colonel Harwood cut in. "This decision is final. You'll report to Major Chen in logistics at 800 tomorrow." As the room emptied, only Captain Reeves remained behind. He approached Diane, genuine regret in his eyes. "This isn't right," he said quietly. "You saved those planes today." Diane finally allowed herself to look away from the spot on the wall, meeting his gaze. "Apparently that wasn't my job. What will you do?" She thought about her options, which seemed suddenly very limited. 3 years of training, countless hours in simulators, all her sacrifices, wiped away because she couldn't pretend to be someone she wasn't. "I'll report to Major Chen at 800, she said finally. "What else can I do?" That evening, Diane sat alone in her quarters, still in her flight suit, unable to bring herself to take it off. On her small desk sat the framed photo of her mother, who had worked double shifts at the hospital for years to help Diane afford flying lessons. Next to it was the acceptance letter to the Air Force Academy, now creased and worn from being read so many times. She picked up the photo, tracing her finger along the edge. "Sorry, Mom," she whispered. "Looks like I'm grounded." But even as she said the words, something inside Diane refused to accept them as final. Grounded for now, perhaps, but the sky was where she belonged, and somehow, someday, she would find her way back to it. She just didn't know yet what it would take to get there. 3 years passed like a slow-moving storm for Diane Reynolds. Each morning, she woke before dawn, laced up her running shoes, and jogged the perimeter of Westfield Air Force Base. She always timed her run to coincide with the first takeoffs of the day. The roar of engines overhead made her heart ache with a familiar longing as she watched the jets climb into the pink-orange sky. "Morning, Reynolds," called Technical Sergeant Wilson from the security gate. "Still trying to outrun those planes?" "One of these days," Diane replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. After her run, she'd shower, put on her uniform, and report to the logistics center where she now spent her days tracking supply chains, managing inventory, and coordinating deliveries. She was good at it, meticulous, efficient, forward-thinking. Major Chen had promoted her twice, and she now oversaw the entire fuel management system for the base. "You've got a mind for patterns," the major had told her. "You see connections others miss." It was meant as a compliment, but it only reminded Diane of what she'd lost. That same ability to see patterns was what had gotten her grounded in the first place. On a sweltering Tuesday in late August, Diane was updating the fuel delivery schedule when the base alarm sounded. Not the usual drill alarm, this was the real thing. She stepped outside to see a massive column of dark smoke rising from the eastern hills. "It's bad," said Lieutenant Harrison, rushing past with a stack of maps. "The governor just declared a state of emergency. They're activating us for support ops." Within hours, the base transformed into a hub of emergency response. Diane found herself reassigned to the command center, where her intimate knowledge of the base's resources made her suddenly invaluable. She stood beside Major Chen as Colonel Harwood, now a one-star general, entered the room. Harwood's eyes flicked over her briefly, showing a flicker of recognition, but nothing more. He turned immediately to the large screen showing the fire's spread. "What are we looking at?" he demanded. "Fire started as a controlled burn that jumped containment lines," explained Fire Chief Torres, pointing to the map. "It's now threatening 3 communities and moving fast. We've got evacuation orders in place, but this drought has everything bone dry. The wind isn't helping either." "What resources do they need from us?" Harwood asked. "They're requesting water bombers for direct support and helicopters for evacuation assistance. The smoke is creating visibility issues, so they need our pilots." Harwood nodded. "Make it happen." For the next 2 days, Diane barely left the command center. She coordinated fuel reserves, calculated maximum flight times, and ensured supplies reached the forward bases where pilots staged their operations. Through it all, she watched the video feeds as pilots she once trained with flew through hellish conditions to drop water on the advancing flames. On the 3rd day, things took a turn for the worse. "We've lost the eastern containment line," Chief Torres announced, his face grim beneath the soot and exhaustion. "The fire jumped the ridge and is moving toward Miller Creek. That's 3,000 more people who need to evacuate, and the road's already jammed." "What about the northern approach?" asked Captain Reeves, who now led the air support operations. "Can we concentrate drops there to slow the advance?" Torres shook his head. "Smoke's too thick. Visibility's near zero. We can't risk the aircraft." Diane studied the topographical display as the others argued about alternatives. Something about the fire's movement pattern caught her attention. She zoomed in on the northern section. "May I?" she asked, stepping forward. Harwood frowned but nodded. "The fire is following the contours of the land," Diane said, tracing the progression with her finger. "Look at how it's moved over the past 12 hours. It's not random, it's being channeled by these ravines and ridgelines." She switched to a wind current overlay. "And the prevailing wind is creating a funnel effect here, accelerating the fire's advance toward this valley, which leads directly to Miller Creek." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed what she was showing them. "So what's your point, Lieutenant?" Harwood asked, a hint of his old impatience in his voice. "My point is that if we understand the pattern, we might find a weakness." Diane zoomed in further. "The fire has to pass through this narrow canyon to reach the valley. It's a choke point." Chief Torres leaned in, interested now. "Even if you're right, what good does it do us? We can't get water bombers in there with this smoke." Diane hesitated, aware of all eyes on her. The idea forming in her mind was unorthodox at best, possibly insane at worst. "What if we don't use water?" she said finally. "What if we disrupt the fire's oxygen supply instead?" "Explain," said Major Chen. "Fires need 3 things: fuel, heat, and oxygen. We can't remove the fuel. The entire mountainside is tinder dry. We can't lower the heat enough with the resources we have. But what if we could momentarily disrupt the oxygen flow at the choke point? And how exactly would you suggest we do that?" Harwood asked, skepticism heavy in his voice. Diane took a deep breath. A sonic boom. The silence that followed was deafening. A what now? Chief Torres finally asked. A fighter jet, flying supersonic at precisely the right altitude over the canyon. The pressure wave from the sonic boom would create a momentary vacuum effect, disrupting the fire's oxygen supply at the choke point. It might be enough to break its momentum and give your ground crews a chance to establish a new line. Captain Reeves was the first to recover. I've never heard of such a thing. Because it's never been done, Harwood said flatly. It's absurd. The conditions alone make it practically suicide. Actually, said a voice from the back of the room. A gray-haired man in a rumpled Forest Service uniform stepped forward. There's some scientific basis for this. Soviet researchers experimented with shock waves for fire suppression in the 1960s. Never deployed it in the field, though. For good reason, Harwood replied. The pilot would have to fly blind through smoke at treetop level, hit supersonic speed at exactly the right moment, and then somehow avoid slamming into a mountain. Even if it worked in theory, it's too dangerous in practice, he turned to Torres. Chief, let's focus on realistic options. What about creating a larger fire break to the west of Miller Creek? The conversation moved on, but Diane couldn't let go of her idea. As the meeting dispersed, she approached the Forest Service scientist. Dr. Kozlov, he introduced himself, shaking her hand. Interesting theory you have there. Do you really think it could work? She asked. The physics are sound, he said thoughtfully. The practical application is another matter. Your general is right about the dangers. But if someone could do it, if the pilot knew the terrain well enough, it might save Miller Creek? Dr. Kozlov studied her face. You were a pilot. I was, she admitted, and now you're not. Yet you still think like one. He handed her a thumb drive. These are my research notes on pressure wave dynamics and fire behavior. Probably won't help, but who knows. Sometimes the crazy ideas are the only ones left when the sensible ones fail. That night, Diane sat alone in the logistics office, poring over Dr. Kozlov's data and comparing it with the topographical maps of the canyon. The more she calculated, the more convinced she became that her idea could work. But Harwood would never approve it. At midnight, the emergency alert system pinged with an update. The fire had accelerated beyond predictions. Miller Creek evacuation was now mandatory, but traffic jams were stranding hundreds of people. The morning forecast called for even stronger winds. Diane closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision forming in her mind. Opening them again, she began accessing the base's flight schedule for the next morning. Her logistics clearance gave her access to nearly every system on base. Few people realized just how much power that actually gave her. She made small, careful adjustments. A maintenance delay here, a personnel reassignment there. By the time she finished, there would be an F-16 prepped and ready at 0600, scheduled for a reconnaissance flight that had been deprioritized but never removed from the system. Next, she accessed the security footage loops from the previous week, finding a quiet day when the hangar area had seen minimal activity. It took her 3 hours to splice together enough clean footage to create a convincing security feed overlay. As the first hint of dawn colored the eastern sky, or would have, if not for the thick smoke, Diane slipped into the locker room and found her old flight suit. It no longer had her name patch, but it still fit. She pulled her hair back, tucked it under a cap, and made her way to the hangar. "Morning, Lieutenant," said the sleepy guard, barely glancing at her ID as she swiped it through the reader. The system beeped green. She had authorized herself for hangar access last night. "Early mission?" he asked. "Recon flight," she replied casually, trying to get some infrared readings on the fire line before the day crews go up. "Good luck with that smoke," he said, turning back to his coffee. The F-16 waited on the tarmac like a patient predator. Diane ran her hand along its fuselage, feeling a surge of emotion she hadn't allowed herself in years. She performed the pre-flight check methodically, her hands remembering every switch and dial as if she'd never left. "This is crazy," she whispered to herself as she climbed into the cockpit. Absolutely crazy. But as the canopy lowered and the familiar hum of instruments surrounded her, something settled in Diane's chest. A certainty. This was where she belonged. She started the engine and was halfway through her taxi to the runway when the radio crackled. "Unscheduled aircraft. This is Tower. Identify yourself and state your mission." Diane keyed her mic. "Tower, this is..." She paused for a fraction of a second. "This is Lieutenant Reynolds. Reconnaissance Flight Sierra 79er. A long pause followed. Then, Lieutenant Reynolds? Our schedule shows that flight assigned to Captain Henderson. Last-minute change, Diane said smoothly. Check with Colonel Martinez. She had selected a name from the visiting contingent from another base, knowing it would take time to verify. Another pause. Hold position, Lieutenant. We're verifying. Diane continued taxiing toward the runway. Roger that, Tower. Holding at checkpoint Charlie. She was not, in fact, holding at all. Lieutenant Reynolds, you are not cleared for takeoff. Repeat, you are not cleared for takeoff. Too late. Diane pushed the throttle forward, feeling the powerful surge of the F-16 as it began racing down the runway. The radio exploded with voices, the loudest being General Harwood's. Reynolds, stand down immediately. That's a direct order. As the wheels lifted off the tarmac, Diane felt a weight lifting from her soul along with them. I'm sorry, General, she replied calmly, but 3,000 people might die if I follow orders today. She banked the jet toward the eastern hills where the smoke rose like a dark wall against the morning sky. Below, she could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles and the distant orange glow of the approaching fire line. I'm going to need real-time data on wind direction at the canyon, she said into the radio, her voice steady and professional. And someone get Dr. Kozlov to the command center. He'll understand what I'm trying to do. Then she pushed the F-16 forward, disappearing into the smoke. The F-16 sliced through the morning air as Diane guided it toward the towering wall of smoke ahead. In the cockpit, warning indicators were already flashing, cautioning against the reduced visibility conditions. She silenced them with practiced movements. There was no turning back now. Her radio crackled continuously with orders to return to base, threats of court-martial, and demands for explanation. She tuned them out, focusing instead on her instruments and the mission ahead. General, she finally responded, her voice leveled despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. I understand I'll face consequences for this, but right now those people in Miller Creek need a miracle, and I think I can give them one. Please put Dr. Kozlov on the line. There was a long pause before a new voice came through her headset. Lieutenant Reynolds, this is Kozlov. What you're attempting has never been done outside a laboratory. The variables, I know the risks, she cut in, but I need your help. I'm going to attempt a supersonic run through Cooper's Canyon at the fire's choke point. I need real-time wind data and the exact coordinates where the fire front is currently meeting the canyon walls. Another pause, followed by muffled voices arguing in the background. Lieutenant, General Harwood's voice returned, tense but controlled. This is reckless and unauthorized. But since you've already taken the aircraft, we won't let you fly blind, patching you through to Fire Command for coordinates. Dr. Kozlov will advise on approach. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. Thank you, sir. Diane pushed the fighter jet higher, climbing above the smoke layer to get her bearings. From this altitude, the scale of the disaster became horrifyingly clear. The fire had consumed nearly 40,000 acres, its leading edge now a ravenous orange line creeping steadily toward the town of Miller Creek. Emergency vehicles crawled along clogged roads like tiny insects, their lights barely visible through the haze. Fire Command to Falcon 1, a new voice called through her radio. Fire front currently advancing through northern edge of Cooper's Canyon. Coordinates uploading to your navigation system now. Diane checked the incoming data. Received. What's the wind speed and direction at the canyon? Currently 22 knots gusting to 35 direction east-southeast. Forecast to increase within the hour. Not ideal but workable. She banked the jet, beginning a wide circle to position herself for the approach. Dr. Kozlov, what altitude would create the optimal pressure wave effect? Based on the canyon dimensions, approximately 320 feet above terrain at the narrowest point, the scientist replied. But Lieutenant, the smoke density means you'll be flying almost completely blind. The margin for error is... I know these mountains, Diane interrupted. I've flown training missions through this range for 3 years, and I've spent the last 3 mapping every delivery route in this region, including the fire roads through that canyon. It wasn't completely true. She knew the topography from maps and simulations, but she'd never actually flown through the canyon itself. That had been reserved for the elite tactical training groups, the ones she'd never had the chance to join. No time for doubts now. Diane dropped altitude, descending toward the smoke layer. As the jet plunged into the dark cloud, visibility instantly reduced to near zero. Her cockpit instruments flickered with interference from the intense heat below. Switching to terrain-following radar and thermal imaging, she announced, more to herself than to her listeners. The world outside her canopy disappeared, replaced by the ghostly green outlines of the radar display and the fiery reds and yellows of the thermal imaging system. It was like flying through hell itself. "Fire Command, what's the status of Miller Creek evacuation?" she asked, needing to know what was at stake. "Roads are gridlocked. We've got approximately 650 people still trying to get out, another 200 sheltering at the high school. If the fire reaches town in its current state, we're looking at catastrophic damage." 850 people. Diane tightened her grip on the controls. "Dr. Kozlov," she called. "For maximum effectiveness, how fast do I need to be traveling when I break the sound barrier?" "Ideally Mach 1.2 exactly at the narrowest point of the canyon. But Lieutenant, the turbulence from the fire will make precision nearly impossible. Let me worry about that." As she approached the canyon entrance, Diane switched to a split-screen view, topographical map on one side, thermal imaging on the other. The fire appeared as an angry red mass consuming everything in its path. The canyon ahead was a narrow corridor of relative calm between two advancing fronts. The turbulence hit like a physical blow, rocking the fighter jet violently. Warning alarms screamed as the aircraft dropped suddenly. Caught in a powerful downdraft, Diane fought the controls, muscles straining as she pulled the nose up and stabilized their descent. "Reynolds, what's your status?" General Harwood demanded, the first hint of concern creeping into his voice. "Encountering severe turbulence," she replied through gritted teeth, "but I'm proceeding with the approach." The canyon walls appeared as ghostly outlines on her radar, growing closer on either side as she maneuvered deeper into the narrow passage. The heat was becoming intense, causing thermal currents that buffeted the aircraft like a toy in a hurricane. "Approaching optimal position," Diane announced. "Current speed Mach 0.85, beginning acceleration." She pushed the throttle forward, feeling the powerful surge as the F-16 responded. The fighter jet leaped ahead, accelerating through the smoke-filled canyon. "Passing Mach 0.95, she reported, her eyes flicking between instruments. Canyon walls approximately 400 meters apart and narrowing. The jet shuddered as another thermal updraft caught its wings. For a heart-stopping moment, Diane felt the aircraft tilting dangerously toward the right canyon wall. She countered with practiced precision, sweat beading on her forehead despite the climate-controlled cockpit. "Mach 1.0, she announced. "Approaching sound barrier." Through her headset came Dr. Kozlov's urgent voice. "Lieutenant, you need to be exactly 320 feet above the canyon floor in 10 seconds to create the optimal pressure wave." Diane glanced at her altimeter. She was at 410 feet, too high. With a quick prayer, she pushed the nose down, descending rapidly through the superheated air as the jet continued to accelerate. "Mach 1.1, she called out. "Altitude 350 feet. The canyon walls were closing in now, the narrowest section just ahead. On her thermal display, she could see the massive wall of fire approaching the same point from the opposite direction. A collision course with destiny. 3 seconds to optimal position, Dr. Kozlov warned. "Mach 115. "Altitude 330 feet, Diane replied, her voice eerily calm despite the chaos around her. The world seemed to slow down in that moment. Every instinct and skill Diane had ever developed came together in perfect harmony as she guided the screaming jet through the heart of the inferno. "Now," Kozlov shouted. "Mach 1.2, altitude 320 feet. Diane confirmed as the F-16 broke through the sound barrier precisely at the narrowest point of the canyon. The sonic boom thundered through the tight space, magnified by the canyon walls. Diane couldn't see the effect directly, but she felt the aircraft shudder as the pressure wave rebounded through the superheated air around her. For a terrible second, nothing happened. "Enid." Then, "Fire Command to Falcon 1, came an incredulous voice. We're seeing a disruption in the fire front. The flame intensity at the canyon mouth is dropping." Diane banked hard, pulling the fighter jet into a steep climb to clear the far canyon wall. As she emerged from the smoke into clear air above, she circled back to see the results of her maneuver. Below, where the solid wall of flame had been marching steadily forward, there was now a visible gap, like a door had been opened in the fire's advance. Ground crews were already racing toward the breach, bulldozers pushing fire breaks and tanker trucks positioning to exploit the unexpected advantage. It worked, she breathed. It actually worked. Confirmed, Dr. Kozlov's voice had an unmistakable note of awe. The pressure wave created a temporary oxygen deficit at the critical juncture. The fire lost momentum at its narrowest point, allowing the ground teams to establish containment lines. For the first time since she'd taken off, General Harwood's voice held something other than anger. Fire Command is reporting the fire line has been broken at Cooper's Canyon. They're establishing a perimeter now. A pause. Well done, Lieutenant. The praise felt surreal after years of dismissal. Diane checked her fuel gauge. The intense maneuvering had burned through her reserves faster than anticipated. Thank you, sir. Request permission to return to base. Fuel level at 22%. Permission granted. And, Lieutenant, Harwood hesitated. Military police will be waiting on the tarmac when you land. Of course they would. Diane had known the consequences from the moment she climbed into the cockpit. Stealing a fighter jet, disobeying direct orders, court-martial offenses under the best circumstances. Understood, sir. As she turned the aircraft toward home, exhaustion suddenly washed over her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the mission was ebbing away, leaving behind the stark reality of what awaited her. Her career, already derailed once, was now likely over for good. But as she flew over Miller Creek, where families were now able to return to their homes, she couldn't bring herself to regret her choice. 850 people were safe. Sometimes the price was worth paying. The base appeared through her canopy as she descended through scattered clouds. The runway stretched out before her, and she could see the flashing lights of military police vehicles gathered at its edge. General Harwood would be there too, she knew, ready to deliver whatever punishment he deemed appropriate. Diane completed her landing checklist, her movements precise despite her fatigue. As the wheels touched down on the concrete runway, she felt an odd sense of peace. Whatever happened next, she had found her way back to the sky, if only for one last flight, and she had proven beyond any doubt that sometimes breaking the rules was the only way to save lives. The F-16 rolled to a stop. Diane opened the canopy and removed her helmet, her eyes squinting against the sudden brightness. As expected, military police approached from both sides, their expressions grim. But behind them stood a crowd of base personnel, pilots, mechanics, fire crew, logistics staff, all watching in silence. And as Diane climbed down from the cockpit, something unexpected happened. They began to applaud. The holding room was small and austere. 4 gray walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and 2 uncomfortable chairs. Diane had been sitting there for 3 hours, still in her flight suit, waiting. The initial adrenaline had long since faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the growing weight of reality. She had stolen a multi-million-dollar fighter jet, disobeyed direct orders, and risked her life on an untested theory. The fact that it had worked wouldn't erase those offenses. The door finally opened and Diane straightened in her chair. She expected General Harwood, or perhaps a military attorney, to inform her of the charges. Instead, it was Captain Reeves carrying 2 cups of coffee. Thought you might need this, he said, sliding one across the table to her. Thanks. Her voice was hoarse from the dry air and smoke inhalation. The coffee burned her throat but felt good going down. How bad is it? Reeves took a seat across from her. Well, you're all over the news. What? A reporter for Channel 8 was covering the evacuation when you flew overhead. Got footage of your jet cutting through the smoke wall. When the fire line broke minutes later, they put 2 and 2 together. He pulled out his phone and showed her the headline. AIR Force Pilot's Daring Maneuver Saves Miller Creek. The brass can't be happy about that, Diane said. Reeves shrugged. They're conflicted. On one hand, you stole a fighter jet and broke about 30 regulations. On the other hand, you saved a town and hundreds of lives using a technique nobody had tried before. Plus, the governor called to personally thank the Air Force for their innovative approach to disaster response. A flicker of hope ignited in Diane's chest, but she quickly tamped it down. She'd learned long ago not to expect fairness. What's going to happen to me? That's being decided right now. There's a meeting in the general's office. Harwood, base legal, the governor's staff, Fire Chief Torres, and some suits from the Pentagon who flew in specifically for this. He checked his watch. They've been at it for 2 hours. Pentagon officials? That couldn't be good. Reeves leaned forward. Listen, Reynolds. What you did was either the bravest or craziest thing I've ever seen. Probably both. But no matter what they decide, you should know that every pilot on this base would have bought you a drink if you weren't locked up in here. The door opened again, this time revealing a stern-faced military police officer. Captain Reeves, they're asking for Lieutenant Reynolds in the general's office. Diane stood, smoothing her rumpled flight suit. Guess it's time. Good luck, Reeves said quietly. The walk to Harwood's office felt like a funeral march. Base personnel stopped what they were doing to watch as she passed, their expressions a mix of awe and sympathy. Diane kept her eyes forward, spine straight, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. The secretary waved her directly into the general's office. Inside, a group of people fell silent as she entered. General Harwood sat behind his desk, flanked by two officers in Pentagon uniforms that Diane didn't recognize. Chief Torres stood near the window, along with a woman in a sharp business suit who had governor's office written all over her. Lieutenant Reynolds, Harwood said, his voice neutral. Please have a seat. Diane sat stiffly in the offered chair, hands folded in her lap to hide their slight tremor. I'm Colonel Patricia Winters, said one of the Pentagon officers, a silver-haired woman with penetrating eyes. This is Major Thomas Lee from the Air Force Special Projects Division. We've been reviewing your unauthorized mission. Before we continue, interrupted the woman from the governor's office, I want to make it clear that from the state's perspective, Lieutenant Reynolds' actions saved hundreds of lives and millions in property damage. Governor Davis is prepared to make that position public if necessary. Colonel Winters nodded. Noted, Ms. Chen. But this remains a military matter. Diane braced herself. Here it came. Dishonorable discharge, possibly criminal charges. Lieutenant, General Harwood began, what you did yesterday was reckless, insubordinate, and completely outside protocol. He paused and something shifted in his expression. It was also effective in a way that none of our approved measures could have been. Diane blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. The technique you employed, using a sonic boom to disrupt the fire's oxygen supply, has never been successfully deployed in a real-world scenario. Colonel Winters continued. The scientific community has been theorizing about it for decades, but no one has had the, let's call it initiative, to actually try it. Major Lee spoke up for the first time. What we're trying to say, Lieutenant, is that while your methods were unorthodox, the results can't be ignored. Dr. Kozlov's preliminary report suggests your approach could be refined into a viable firefighting technique for certain types of wildfires. Hope flickered again, stronger this time, but Diane kept her face carefully neutral. I appreciate that assessment, sir, but I understand there must be consequences for my actions. Oh, there absolutely will be, Harwood said firmly. Taking an aircraft without authorization is a court-martial offense, as is disobeying direct orders. Ms. Chen from the governor's office frowned, but before she could object, Colonel Winters raised a hand. However, given the exceptional circumstances and the outcome of your actions, we've been authorized to offer an alternative. The room fell silent as Colonel Winters opened a folder on the desk. The Air Force has been developing a specialized unit focused on unconventional approaches to natural disaster response. It's still in the planning stages, but yesterday's events have accelerated the timeline. She looked directly at Diane. We're offering you a position with this unit under a probationary status. Diane struggled to keep her composure. What exactly would that entail, ma'am? You would work with Dr. Kozlov and a team of specialists to develop and refine aerial firefighting techniques, including the sonic disruption method you pioneered. You'd be flying again, Lieutenant, but under strict supervision and with explicit mission parameters. It wasn't just a reprieve, it was a second chance, a way back to the sky. Diane felt lightheaded. Of course, Harwood added, this offer comes. As with conditions, you'll be reduced in rank to second lieutenant for a period of 1 year. There will be a formal reprimand in your file, and you'll undergo a complete psychological evaluation before being cleared to fly again. Additionally, Colonel Winters said you'll need to complete a specialized training course at Edwards Air Force Base. It's intensive, designed to identify pilots who can think creatively under extreme pressure. Was more than Diane had dared to hope for. When would this start? Immediately, Major Lee said. The western states are facing their worst fire season in decades. We need this program operational as soon as possible. Diane took a deep breath. Thank you for this opportunity. I accept. The meeting concluded with handshakes and paperwork. As the Pentagon officials left with Ms. Chen, General Harwood asked Diane to stay behind. When they were alone, he walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. 3 years ago, he said, still looking out at the tarmac, I grounded you because I believed you couldn't follow orders, that you were a risk to yourself and others. Diane remained silent, waiting. Yesterday proved me both right and wrong. He turned to face her. You still can't follow orders, but your instincts... He shook his head. Your instincts saved lives when following protocol would have failed. Coming from Harwood, it was as close to an apology as she would ever get. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Reynolds. This new assignment won't be easy. You'll be developing protocols no one has tried before. Flying missions other pilots would consider impossible. The risk of failure is significant. I understand, sir. Do you? He studied her face. This isn't about redemption or second chances. It's about using your particular approach to solve problems conventional thinking can't address. I'm still not convinced it will work. Diane met his gaze steadily. Permission to speak freely, sir? He nodded. I've spent 3 years mapping supply routes, tracking inventory, and managing logistics. I learned to see patterns in chaos, to anticipate needs before they arise. Yesterday, I applied those skills in the air. I'm not the same pilot you grounded 3 years ago. I'm better. Something like respect flickered across Harwood's face. We'll see, Reynolds. Report to Edwards next Monday at 600. They're expecting you. As Diane left the office, a crowd had gathered in the hallway. Pilots, mechanics, ground crew, logistics personnel. They parted to let her through, many nodding in acknowledgement or offering quiet words of congratulation. News traveled fast on a military base. At the end of the corridor stood Major Chen, her former supervisor in logistics. So, he said with a small smile, I hear you're leaving us. Yes, sir. Looks like I'm going back to flying. Good, you were always a terrible office worker, too restless. But there was warmth in his voice. We'll miss your efficiency, though. I learned a lot in logistics, Diane said sincerely. More than I realized until yesterday. Major Chen nodded. Sometimes the detour is part of the journey, not a deviation from it. Later that evening, as the sun set over the base, Diane stood on the observation deck watching F-16s returning from their daily missions. Their engines glowed orange in the fading light as they descended toward the runway. 3 days ago, she had been a grounded pilot with a dead-end career. Tomorrow, she would begin packing for Edwards Air Force Base and a new assignment that combined everything she'd learned, both in the cockpit and out of it. The path hadn't been straight or easy. It had taken a disaster and an act of near-suicidal courage to find her way back to the sky. But as she watched the jets land, Diane realized she wouldn't change any of it. Not the setbacks, not the years in logistics, not even General Harwood's disapproval. Each obstacle had forced her to become more than just a pilot who could follow directions. She had become something rarer, a pilot who could see patterns others missed, who could find solutions where none seemed to exist. A sonic boom echoed across the darkening sky as a jet broke the sound barrier high above, a fitting farewell. Diane smiled. She was going home. 3 months had passed since the day Diane Reynolds stole an F-16 and flew it through a wall of fire. 3 months of intense training at Edwards Air Force Base, working alongside scientists, firefighting experts, and test pilots to develop what the Air Force was now calling atmospheric intervention techniques. The program had been given an official name, Project Firebreak, an unexpected priority after footage of Diane's flight went viral. Public interest in the story of a grounded pilot who saved a town with an experimental technique had caught the imagination of people across the country. Politicians, always attuned to public sentiment, had suddenly found funding for the program. Now, on a scorching July morning, Diane stood on the flight line at the newly established Firebreak Operations Center in Northern California, watching as ground crews prepped 3 modified F-16s. The aircraft had been specially equipped with enhanced thermal imaging systems, reinforced air intakes to handle smoke particulates, and custom navigation equipment designed for low visibility conditions. Nervous? Asked Lieutenant Alvarez, one of the two other pilots who had been selected for the program. Like Diane, they were considered unorthodox thinkers who had sometimes clashed with military convention. "No," Diane replied honestly. "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The past 3 months had transformed her life. The training at Edwards had been grueling. High-speed runs through artificial smoke conditions, precision flying through narrow canyons, extensive classroom work on fire behavior and atmospheric physics. Dr. Kozlov had become both mentor and friend, helping her understand the science behind what she had instinctively done that day at Cooper's Canyon. And surprisingly, General Harwood had become an unexpected ally. Once the Pentagon had officially sanctioned the program, he had thrown his considerable influence behind it, securing resources and clearing bureaucratic hurdles with ruthless efficiency. He still wasn't warm. Diane doubted he ever would be, but his respect was worth more than his friendship. The hangar doors opened, and a convoy of vehicles approached the flight line. Diane recognized the Forest Service trucks and the State Emergency Management Team, but was surprised to see a press van among them. "Heads up," Lieutenant Alvarez muttered. "Looks like we have an audience today." Colonel Winters approached, clipboard in hand. "Change of plans, people. Today's demonstration has been upgraded to an actual mission. We've got a situation developing in the Trinity Mountains." Diane felt a surge of adrenaline. They had run dozens of tests and simulations, but this would be their first real deployment since Miller Creek. "What are we looking at?" she asked. "Lightning strike started a fire near Crystal Lake early this morning. It's moving fast through beetle-killed pine. There's a summer camp with 60 kids about 8 miles downslope. They're evacuating, but the road is narrow and they've only got 2 buses." "What's the terrain like?" Lieutenant Alvarez asked, already pulling up maps on his tablet. "Steep ridges, narrow canyons, similar to the Cooper's Canyon scenario, but with different wind patterns." Colonel Winters handed them weather printouts. "The fire is creating its own weather system. Standard water drops aren't having much effect." Diane studied the maps and data, already seeing patterns forming. "There's a choke point here," she said, pointing to a narrow pass between 2 ridges. "If we could disrupt the fire's progress there, it would buy time for the evacuation." "That's the plan," Colonel Winters agreed. "You'll lead, Reynolds. Alvarez and Patel will provide secondary disruption on your call." The pilots dispersed to prep their aircraft while Colonel Winters handled the press. Diane caught fragments about demonstrating new firefighting techniques and coordinated response with traditional methods. The colonel was being careful not to overpromise, which was smart. Despite all their training, what they were attempting remained experimental. In the locker room, Diane suited up methodically, checking each piece of equipment twice. The specialized flight suit had additional heat protection and an enhanced oxygen system for flying through smoke-heavy environments. As she zipped it up, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her wasn't the same one who had been kicked out of aviation ops 3 years ago. That woman had been uncertain, trying too hard to fit a mold that wasn't shaped for her. This woman knew exactly who she was and what she could do. On her shoulder was a new patch, Project Firebreak's insignia, featuring a stylized fighter jet creating a sonic boom through a wall of flames. "Let's go make some noise," she told her reflection. The pre-flight briefing was concise. Chief Ranger Thompson from the Forest Service outlined the fire's behavior using 3D topographical displays, while meteorologists detailed the wind patterns they'd encounter. Dr. Kozlov, who had flown in overnight, explained the optimal parameters for their sonic disruption. "Remember," he emphasized, "this technique isn't about extinguishing the fire, it's about disrupting its momentum at critical junctures to create opportunities for conventional firefighting methods." And in other words, Colonel Winters added, "You're the surgical strike team, not the occupation force. Get in, break the fire's advance at the choke point, and let the ground crews establish containment line." As the briefing concluded, General Harwood entered unexpectedly. The room snapped to attention. "At ease," he said, waving them down. "I didn't come to interfere, just wanted to observe." His eyes met Diane's briefly, and she saw something in them she'd never seen before. Confidence, not in himself, in her. 20 minutes later, 3 F-16s roared down the runway, climbing steeply into the clear blue sky. Diane led the formation, her call sign now officially Firebreak 1. As they banked toward the Trinity Mountains, She could see the massive smoke plume rising like a thunderhead on the horizon. Firebreak flight. This is control, came Colonel Winter's voice through their headsets. Fire front is advancing at approximately 20 feet per minute. Camp evacuation is underway but proceeding slowly. Time to impact at current rate is 45 minutes. Roger, Control, Diane responded. ETA to target zone 12 minutes. Request final wind updates at the choke point. As they approached, the true scale of the wildfire became apparent. It had already consumed over 2,000 acres, the leading edge a ravenous line of flames devouring everything in its path. Below, they could see the winding road where 2 yellow school buses crawled along, filled with campers. Those kids will never make it out in time at that speed, Lieutenant Patel observed grimly. Diane studied her displays, comparing the real-time data with what she was seeing below. The fire's moving faster than predicted. We need to act now, she banked the aircraft, circling to get a better view of the choke point, a narrow gap between 2 rocky ridges where the fire would be forced to concentrate before spreading toward the camp. Control. This is Firebreak 1. We're initiating sonic disruption sequence. Alvarez, take position Alpha, half-mile spacing. Patel, position Bravo, same spacing. Firebreak 1, be advised, Control warned. Thermal updrafts are exceeding predicted levels. Exercise extreme caution on your approach. Acknowledged, Control. Diane dropped altitude, aligning her aircraft with the narrow passage. The turbulence hit immediately, rocking the F-16 violently. The heat rising from the inferno created invisible air currents that slammed against the aircraft like massive waves. All units, switch to thermal imaging and terrain-following radar, she ordered. Visibility will be near zero inside the smoke column. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the nose down and accelerated toward the wall of smoke. The cockpit darkened instantly as she plunged into the gray-black cloud. Warning indicators flashed, protesting the conditions, but the modified systems held steady. Initiating run, she announced calmly. Speed Mach 0.9, altitude 450 feet above terrain. Through the swirling darkness, her instruments painted a ghostly picture of the canyon ahead. The fire appeared as a seething mass of reds and yellows on her thermal display, concentrated exactly where they had predicted. Accelerating to Mach 1, she reported. Approaching optimal position. The F-16 leaped forward, its powerful engine driving it faster as Diane guided it through the narrow passage. Unlike her first attempt at Miller Creek, this time she had precise instruments, specialized training, and a clear plan. But the fundamental challenge remained the same. Threading a needle at supersonic speed through conditions that no aircraft was designed to handle. Mach 1.1, she called out. 3 seconds to optimal position. The turbulence increased, buffeting the fighter jet mercilessly. For a heart-stopping moment, a massive updraft caught the aircraft's wing, tilting it dangerously toward the canyon wall. Diane countered instantly, her responses honed by hundreds of simulator hours specifically designed for these conditions. Mach 1.2, she announced. Executing sonic disruption. Now. The fighter jet broke the sound barrier precisely at the calculated position, sending a powerful shockwave rippling through the narrow canyon. The pressure differential created a momentary oxygen vacuum at the fire's leading edge, disrupting its advance just as it had at Miller Creek. Firebreak 2, you're up, Diane called as she pulled into a steep climb out of the smoke. Lieutenant Alvarez's aircraft streaked into position 30 seconds later, creating a second sonic boom that compounded the disruption effect. Lieutenant Patel followed, completing the 3-pronged attack. As Diane circled back above the smoke layer, she keyed her radio. Control, requesting visual confirmation of disruption effect. Stand by, Firebreak 1. The seconds stretched into an eternity as they waited for the surveillance drones to assess the impact of their maneuver. Then, Firebreak flight, this is Control, confirming significant disruption to firefront at target location. Flame intensity reduced by approximately 60% along a quarter-mile line. Ground teams moving in to establish containment barriers. A cheer erupted over the radio from the ground crews. Diane allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. Not bad for our first official mission, Lieutenant Alvarez commented. It's not over yet, Diane reminded them. Let's maintain aerial observation and be ready for a second run if those containment lines don't hold. For the next 2 hours, they circled above the fire zone, occasionally dropping lower to assess conditions or provide targeting information to ground teams. The containment strategy was working. The fire's advance toward the camp had been halted, giving the buses time to complete the evacuation. By late afternoon, they were cleared to return to base. As they approached the runway, Diane was surprised to see a crowd gathered along the perimeter fence, civilians with phones and cameras, capturing their return. "Looks like we've got a fan club," Lieutenant Patel observed. "Get used to it," Colonel Winters said as they taxied to a stop. "The press has been broadcasting live updates all day. Project Firebreak just went from experimental to headline news." As Diane climbed down from her cockpit, she was met not by military police this time, but by General Harwood, Dr. Kozlov, and a group of officials including the state's fire commissioner and a representative from the governor's office. "Exceptional work, Captain Reynolds," Harwood said, emphasizing her new rank. "The promotion had come through just yesterday, thank you, sir. But it was a team effort." She gestured to her fellow pilots and the ground support crew. "Indeed it was," agreed the fire commissioner, stepping forward to shake her hand. "And a successful one. Initial reports suggest your intervention technique saved not only time for the evacuation but prevented the fire from jumping the ridge toward 3 more communities." The debriefing that followed was thorough but positive. The mission had proven that their technique, while not a silver bullet, could be a valuable tool in the firefighting arsenal when properly applied. Plans were already being discussed to expand the program to other bases in wildfire-prone regions. As the meeting concluded, Dr. Kozlov pulled Diane aside. "Who would have thought," he said with a smile, "that when you stole that jet 3 months ago you would end up changing how we fight wildfires?" Diane laughed. "I was just trying not to crash or get shot down. Changing firefighting tactics wasn't exactly on my mind." Later that evening, as the sun set over the airfield, Diane stood alone at the edge of the runway, watching the fading light paint the sky in shades of orange and red. 3 years ago, being grounded had felt like the end of her career. Now she understood it had only been the beginning of a different path, one that had led her exactly where she needed to be. A distant rumble caught her attention, and she looked up to see another formation of jets returning from a training mission. Their sleek silhouettes cut across the sunset, free and powerful, just like her. Behind her, she heard footsteps approaching. Turning, she saw Colonel Winters with a folder in hand. "Sorry to interrupt your moment, Captain, but I thought you'd want to see these right away." She handed over the folder. "Preliminary approval for Project Firebreak to establish permanent operations at 5 additional bases across the western states. And guess who they want to lead the training program?" Diane opened the folder, scanning the documents with growing amazement. "This is happening very fast." "Success tends to do that," Colonel Winters replied with a rare smile. "When something works, bureaucracy can move surprisingly quickly. Besides, after today's mission, you've got fans in high places." As the colonel walked away, Diane turned back to the sunset, the folder clutched in her hands. From grounded pilot to program director in 3 months, it was almost unbelievable. But then so was flying an F-16 through a wall of fire to save a town. Sometimes the most unlikely paths led to the most important destinations. And sometimes, being kicked out of one door only meant finding another one that had been waiting all along. The final light of day glinted off the new insignia on her shoulder, the fighter jet bursting through flames. Not just a symbol anymore, but a reality she had created by refusing to stay grounded. Diane Reynolds smiled and walked back toward the hangar, where her team was waiting for her to lead them into tomorrow.